the last question for Michelle Stroud is, what departmental admin resources are you using to track student retention, course performance? So we have two sources of data. We have the university's institutional analysis, and we have someone in the institutional analysis office that is assigned to School of Computing, and they provide a bunch of the data. We have to ask for it. Sometimes it takes some time, but every time I need something for some purpose, I ask them. And sometimes they say, no, I can't get you that. And in particular, the one that tracks students in a cohort from one semester to another, that's really hard to get. But if I want individual students, that's really hard to get. We have a way of doing that internally with their university ID. One person has FERPA, approval to do that sort of thing, and that's actually a faculty member. So we don't do very many of those things as a consequence.
Maybe one question that came up was disaggregating data. Say you have multiple programs, or you're thinking about multiple departments, say EE, CS, IS, something like that. How do you think about disaggregating, or when to disaggregate or when to not disaggregate?
I guess it depends on whether you can disaggregate. I think because if you can't, then maybe you just are happy. At some point you end up deciding you love the data that you're able to get, or you try to do better, but sometimes it's just really hard to get the kinds of information you want. And keep in mind there's another option, which is to survey the students. And I think Tracy's going to talk about that a little bit more, so I will leave that. Who looks at the data and with what frequency? So there's certain things we look at every year. In particular, like the DFW rate, and there's certain percentages we're tracking and all of that. And who does it is really actually faculty, which is probably not a very satisfactory answer. So Tracy says she has a data chair. We also have someone who's doing some data analysis with respect to our grad recruiting, not a topic today, but these days that's getting a lot easier. What role can qualitative data play in the context phase? Yeah, so surveys really help a lot with identifying student experience issues and things that are hard to get at from just counting who's in a class. Yeah, we have a question that's a really good question. My understanding is that tracking data is a valid BPC project. And that is, and in fact, if you're not collecting data right now, that can be a great initial project to start collecting data, because it actually, you have to find, you have to track down all the people who have access to the data and what kind of data you can get. So that's great. And being a data chair is also good. Yeah, that was an answer.
Who reviews the data once it's collected?
So we make it available in some faculty discussion or retreat so that all the faculty are aware of what's going on. Often you have staff whose job is to track this type of data. I mean, if you have in your department staff, you're very fortunate. We have institutional, we have access to a staff member in the institutional analysis office, and that works really well. And they can get us all sorts of things that we didn't even think of. Shouldn't there be a few common goals that all of us agree to so we can compare results between institutions? I'm not sure what goals you're referring to.
No, I'd be into that. Like, everybody track their retention between CS1 and CS2 and improve retention among these groups at your institution. And like, I would be really excited if there were folks, particularly on this call, to be like, hey, in the Slack channel, let's get other people to adopt this goal too. I think that could be hugely impactful.
How do you envision collaborating with the University Officer of Diversity and Inclusion if you have one? So here's a couple of ideas. So one thing that we started doing in our faculty meeting is finding resources on campus, such as we have a Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Office. and have them come to faculty meetings, and I was organizing a series in the College of Engineering office as well, and talk about, microaggressions and inclusive teaching and things like that. And so, so one way to use those resources on campus is to have them help train your faculty, and if you have a way to do this, maybe your students as well. Another way is they may have programs available that you can leverage to help your BPC plan. So, they may have activities that you can include in your BPC plan.
The last comment was about my proposal to track retention.
Yeah.
CS1 to CS2, and Susan was mentioning that sometimes students skip CS2, so that might be a tricky one for a shared goal. But I do think it's exciting to think about everybody in this call is thinking about creating goals for their department, and the extent to which we can be reviewing each other's plans and sharing what we're doing. We can think about finding similar institutions where it would be really cool to have shared goals. And because there might not be a ton of people at each of our institutions who cares about BPC, creating those across department partnerships and across institution partnerships could, I think, be really motivating and help us be more impactful.
Comparing yourself too closely to other institutions. Every institution attracts a different group of students from different demographics. Don't think you're failing because you're a little bit worse than somebody else in something, although do use that as an aspirational observation.
I went back to earlier chat. So many stats don't qualify whether they are US students or all student. Mine were all students in my university, not distinguishing whether they're international or not. And there's this other problem which I don't necessarily have a good answer to. What about the people who refuse, who don't respond, or if you're maybe they don't respond because they only have two choices for gender, or maybe they don't respond because they think it's a question that invades their privacy, or maybe they don't respond because for some reason they didn't check the box when they were registering, and so you don't know, when you don't get a response, you don't know how to count for the collection of people that don't respond. And you have to be a little careful because sometimes there will be some default behavior for people who don't respond, and you have to make sure you understand what your university is doing with those. It usually works best to talk about a percentage relative to the people that respond.
So there's some questions about faculty and staff, and we firmed up our draft of the faculty retention resources that are going to be added to BPCnet. I'd guess that we'd get those added before the third day of the workshop, so probably not before tomorrow, but I think we could sneak people a draft of those if you're really interested.
Faculty and staff, also grad students, postdocs, et cetera, et cetera. We happen to do pretty well, other than our other categories look a lot better.
And I think it's really important that someone else's goals might not work for you because you've got weird institutional things going on, and that's fine. Do you know what I mean? You're going to make impact in other places. We've got a question: would it be reasonable to divide BPC goals 5 different ways: undergrad, grad, postdoc, faculty, and staff? Certainly that seems cool, but you also could focus on one piece. There's a lot of work to be done, and the extent to which you have an instinct about what is most broken and need of fixing, that might be the best place to start. And if you've got faculty who are really motivated, or folks who are really motivated to fix a particular piece or to address a particular problem, then you might focus on that first too. Thinking about the extent to which sometimes conversations of focusing on women, because we can pick just a single group that we're focused on, you might focus only on women, but I think it's really important when you do that to make sure that you're remembering that women also have a race. And so by focusing on women, you are implicitly focusing on women of color, and we're not falling into the pitfall of assuming that women means white women. And that really, I think, happens a lot in our BPC community. And so particularly folks on this call that should be something that we really focus on, that we say, when we say women, we mean women of all races. When we say women, we mean women of varying abilities. Do you know what I mean? So disabled women, not disabled women, that everybody's got multiple dimensions of their identity. And so we might focus on one group, but remembering those multiple dimensions is important.
Let me extend that, because I think that happens a lot of times. We ignore that intersectionality, and you have to look at it. I mean, if you have women that are dropping out of your program and you ignore the intersectionality, and you later find out there was only Black and Latina women leaving the program, it might not be a gender issue. It might be a different issue. So you have to, even if you focus on women, I think you have to look at the intersectionality and understand, because there might be differences within the gender dimension.
Been a lot of chat comments that have something to do with the different way people get into their programs, whether it's open or closed admission, how AP impact, and so forth. I don't know if there's comments to make on those, but I keep seeing that trend.
Yeah, I think one of the comments was the belief that you're going to have more men and probably not people of color in the AP class that have taken the AP test. Although it's gotten a lot better in the last couple of years.
And I think in general, it's really important to recognize the racial inequity in access to high school computer science instruction. So Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people are much less likely to attend a high school that offers computer science. And then within those high schools, women are much less likely to have taken one of those computer science courses. So when we think about on the college level, if we have enrollment policies or major declaration policies that advantage students who had high school access to computer science, then we are amplifying existing racial inequity. And I think it is a very reasonable expectation of our academic institutions that we do not amplify existing racial inequity. We might not see it as our responsibility to address like the K-12 racial inequity, but not amplifying existing racial inequity. And I think we need to be really careful in crafting our goals, our requirements for becoming a major and what it means to be successful as a major. A good example is UCSD. They have a lottery to participate in the CS major. Everyone deserves to be a computer science major. Not everyone gets to be a computer science major. And so they have a reasonable grade threshold. And if someone's on from UCSD, you can interrupt and tell the story yourself, but they have a reasonable grade threshold being like, oh, you passed these classes and are on a path to success. They set it at about the 25th percentile. You have to get above the 25th percentile in those introductory courses, which is reasonable if you haven't had high school experience, and then it's a lottery. So I think there's cool models out there to think about shifting your policies to not amplify existing racial inequity.
Colleen, I wanted to add also that you can those inequities in access to AP also affect students and how they progress through your curriculum. So you can look at your curriculum and figure out, are students being disadvantaged just because they don't have that AP credit based on what classes they have to take together, for example. We've seen that at Notre Dame, and so that's one of our activities, is to try and address that and figure out how we should reorganize our curriculum and our advising, to be frank, to make sure that students who don't have all of that AP credit aren't being inadvertently disadvantaged in ways.
We have a similar problem with math preparation, and it has to do with whether what schools you went to and whether you were encouraged to take math classes, and those things can be very hard for early students to deal with, and making up that math preparation so that they can be successful in their computer science classes.
And we've got two more questions. One was a question about the UCSD piece. Is that a lottery for everyone or just the UCSD existing students? Good question. That's the existing UCSD students who are transferring in. And at UCSD, the computer science and engineering department finds that the campus admissions committee that determines who gets to become a CS major directly from high school does a reasonable job of not advantaging students who have high school computer science instruction, so that that group is already doing a reasonable job not amplifying existing racial inequity. But they used to have a competitive enrollment process that was amplifying existing racial inequity. The second question was, do we have a bank of K-12 data that we can use to show where students or our domestic students are in terms of T0 in college? And there's a few pieces. So BPCNet has resources so you can identify the demographics of your state. There are other resources that we point to online where you can identify at a more granular level, like what's your region, but that might not be who you pull from. So like it's a little bit tricky, but also AP has test taking rates. So you can see from your state, if a group disaggregated by race and gender has more than 5 people in it, you can see how many took it and what average score they got. But it doesn't give you exactly what you want potentially, and potentially surveying your students is the most impactful way to figure out that information.
Or institutional assessment should have access to what advanced placement students came in with as well.
It's also on Data Buddies survey.
You might really love to know that the Computing Research Association Center for Evaluating the Research Pipeline, CERP, has a resource, Data Buddies, and they'll survey your students. And you're like, Colleen, that must be very expensive. No, it's free. And if you have some follow-up questions, I know, I'm sorry, they're embarrassed because I'm embarrassing, but yeah, so the CERP team is on the call. They're happy to answer any of your questions. It's free. And then you get a customized report that compares you to your peer institutions to be like, oh gosh, these numbers look really bad for the number of my students who report having a mentor. How do they compare to similar institutions? Oh gosh, they're statistically significantly worse. We really need to focus on that. So everybody you should end the meeting being like, oh, and that's great, I signed up for Data Buddies.